Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and in the second video of the day, I want to talk about John Wall and the Houston Rockets. I've had some pretty strong opinions about John Wall in the past and about what he is going to look like this season, and I'm not ready to just fully backpedal on those, but I think it's worth having a conversation based off how he's looked in, yes, preseason games, but still, when you haven't seen someone like John Wall in so long, you can learn a lot from preseason games in terms of his health, in terms of how he's playing, and I think it's worth having a conversation about him in today's video, the second of today's videos. But quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload twice a day, every day, all throughout the NBA offseason, so it's a great place for consistent NBA content. You can also leave a like rating on the video as well. Helps me out a ton, lets me know that you're enjoying the content, and helps get it out to more people on YouTube as well. You can also check out the first video of the day that I put out earlier talking about the Brooklyn Nets and how they've looked, and Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and the outlook for that group this year. You can check that out. That's already been posted today. But with all those things said, let's go and get started and talk about John Wall. So this idea for this video kind of started when I really started thinking about my opinion on John Wall before he got hurt. And have I undervalued him? Have I put too much of an emphasis on the injury that he sustained rather than thinking about the player that John Wall was in his best season in Washington and the context of that situation and the complementary pieces that were or were not around John Wall in comparison to what could be around him here in Houston, and the possibility that he could still be a really, really good player with the Rockets, which you would hope he would be given the amount he's going to be being paid. So my first thought here was, what was the spacing like when he was in Washington? What were the complementary pieces like? And then did they have enough shooting around him? Because we all know that John Wall is not going to be a guy that is going to be, a super efficient three-point shooter. He needs spacing around him to attack the rim and kick it out. And was he making the best of a situation that maybe wasn't ideal for him? So I went back and I looked at the three-point numbers for the last couple of really healthy John Wall seasons. You can see the numbers on screen here. For the most part, they were a top 10 three-point percentage team, which is good. But the attempts were never really there unless you go all the way back to the 2015-16 season, which they were top 15, top half of the league. But even in a season in which John Wall averaged almost 11 assists per game, was an all-NBA caliber player, this wasn't a high-volume three-point shooting team in Washington, even though they were making a good amount. So you could argue that even given relatively limited spacing, John Wall did an awesome job as a Washington Wizard of putting up the numbers that he did and leading that team to 49 wins in his best season and nearly a conference finals appearance as well. And maybe he deserves more credit for that. And maybe in contrast to that situation in Washington, there's going to be much more spacing in a style that fits what he does much better here in Houston. Because even though Daryl Morey's not there, James Harden wants to leave, and Mike D'Antoni's not there, it's not like Houston is suddenly going to go back to not taking threes. And ideally, just because of the difference in basketball in 2017 compared to the basketball in 2020 and 2021, there should be more spacing around John Wall, which should be more conducive to the offensive game that he brings to the table. And Houston does have some guys on this roster that can shoot the basketball that have been used to a very spacing-oriented system, and that should help him. Now, the other part to this is it's not just like the numbers that John Wall's putting up. John Wall could have put up 30 points in either preseason game, and I not felt the need to talk about him. But it's the manner in which he's scoring the ball, and it's not like he's getting lucky on jump shots. It's not like he's hitting mid-range shots all the time. He has a level of explosiveness and quickness that I did not expect to see from him given the injury history, given the Achilles thing, given the knee stuff that he was dealing with even before that. And that really is what pushed me towards making this video and thinking about the past context of Wall's career and if I undervalued what he could potentially bring to the table for this upcoming season. Now, again, in contrast to that Washington situation, it's possible that he ends up with a better complementary roster around him. Not necessarily in terms of the combination of him and Bradley Beal, who were one of the better backcourts in the league when they were both healthy, but just the overall pieces around John Wall. Let's make the assumption that James Harden gets traded for pieces, and for pieces that make sense on a current roster with Wall and DeMarcus Cousins, who's looked good as well. It's possible that that could end up being the best roster that John Wall has ever had. As good as Bradley Beal is and was, he's a better player now than he was back then. He was still trying to kind of figure it out. He was a very good player though. And then, but apart from that, it was like Otto Porter, Markieff Morris, Marcin Gortat, not a ton of depth apart from that. And if you're taking the Bradley Beal part out of the equation here, Houston could arguably put a better roster around John Wall than he's ever had in his entire career if they were able to move James Harden for significant current pieces which could allow for him to not only be an even better player this year, maybe even all-star caliber guard, but rehab his trade image if that's something that Houston wants to do down the road to continue to look towards a long-term goal and a long-term future for this roster, which is significant. So when you're comparing the two situations in Washington and Houston, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that it was a bad situation in Washington, because it was still a good team. It was a team that almost made the conference finals, and it was a team that definitely had talent, whether it be Beal, or you can say what you want about Markieff Morris or Marcin Gortat, but it was definitely a top-heavy team. It was a team that both Beal and Wall had to carry a lot of the offensive responsibility, and maybe it'll just be a better fit in Houston. And then also, again, to be clear, I'm not saying that John Wall is suddenly going to be an all-NBA caliber guy again, just based off 2 preseason games, and it's definitely possible that the injury stuff just catches up to him, and we're looking at this 3 months from now thinking, man, John Wall's one of the worst contracts in the league. He can't stay on the floor. He's an inefficient player. The other pieces they got for the Harden trade just don't fit around Wall. They'll probably look to move him at some point. Boogie Cousins doesn't look good. That disaster, quote-unquote, scenario certainly still exists for Houston. It's the reason they got a first-round pick in exchange for Russell Westbrook to get John Wall. But I'm just saying that it's possible that maybe I undervalued him a bit. So now let's extend that towards this Rockets team as a whole and what they could potentially look like this upcoming season. So I just, to be safe, took Houston out of the playoff picture in my own personal standings when I was doing predictions, because I didn't know what the Harden thing was going to look like. I didn't know if he was going to end up playing, how awkward that would be, if Wall was going to be good, if DeMarcus Cousins was going to be able to do anything, if Christian Wood was just going to be a fluke. I didn't know if they did eventually trade Harden, it was going to be for mostly picks and young players rather than actual players. It's a very tough West. I just kind of threw my hands up and said, you know what? I'll pick 8 other teams that I think are going to make the playoffs and not involve Houston in that. I think I had Houston as like my 9 or my 10 in my little document that I wrote up about all the different standings and stuff like that I'll talk about eventually in an East and West full season preview. But if John Wall's good, if they get good pieces, or if Harden for some reason tomorrow decides to suddenly play for the Rockets anyway, which seems unlikely at this point, Wood is good, Cousins is healthy, this should still be a playoff team in the West, and they would end up pushing out one of those teams like potentially Portland or Memphis or New Orleans or Phoenix, or whoever you have maybe potentially at the back half of that Western Conference playoff picture. Houston could certainly be in play for that as a result of John Wall just being better than people thought that he would. Now, if you just take Harden off the roster and you're not really accounting for a ton of help for whatever they get in exchange for Harden, the roster doesn't look great. It's like Wall, Christian Wood, DeMarcus Cousins, and some wing guys, and PJ Tucker doesn't seem especially happy either, so maybe he gets moved. And that roster in itself, in my opinion, is not enough to make the postseason in the Western Conference, maybe in the East. And that's a possible scenario, by the way, for part of the season, that it's just like Harden's just a non-factor, or the pieces they get in exchange for Harden are a non-factor, and they're just not a playoff team. Now, there's also a scenario that exists that they swap James Harden for Ben Simmons, and then, they're a really, really good team, and they struggle a bit with spacing between, Simmons and Wall's struggles in that area, but it's still a really, really fun and interesting team and a possible playoff team in the West. So similar to the first video of the day today, there's a lot of variance in terms of what could happen with this Houston Rockets roster this season. John Wall could be awesome. Harden could decide to play, or they get really good pieces, and they're like the 5th seed in the West all over again. And John Wall's like an all-star caliber guy. Boogie rehabs his image a bit as like an actual starter again. And that's definitely a possibility. On the other end of the spectrum, Wall could get hurt. The Harden situation could get way more awkward. They don't get a ton of pieces in exchange for him, and they're just not very good defensively, and they're like the 10th seed. That's also a realistic possibility in my opinion. So I'm not willing to backtrack suddenly on all this John Wall stuff and say that, oh, he's going to be really good. It's definitely a good sign the way that he's looked in the preseason, and just that he looks healthy, which is such a critical component of this. But for me, for right now, I'm at least considering the idea that John Wall could be like an all-star caliber guy this year. Whether it happens or not, we'll have to wait and see. But that's just kind of where I'm at on not only John Wall, but the Rockets as a whole. And I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below about what you think about not only John Wall, but the Houston Rockets in general. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. As I said, you can check out that Nets video from earlier today, as I upload 2 times every single day. Hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.